We all know Snoop Dogg, the guy who somehow went from 90s gangsta rap to selling you breakfast cereal and hanging out with Martha Stewart. But did you know that in 2022, just days before he performed at the Super Bowl, Snoop quietly bought the entire Death Row Records brand? It's the same legendary label that launched his whole career 3 decades earlier, the one that had been passed around by private equity firms and a toy company like a used car. The kid who got discovered by that label came back and bought the whole thing, and what he's built around it in California is a genuine empire. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Full Circle Power Move. Let's start with Death Row, because the story of how it came back to Snoop is honestly wild, and it's the centerpiece of everything. Rewind to the early 1990s. Death Row Records was the most dangerous, most powerful force in hip-hop, the label behind Dr. Dre's The Chronic and Snoop's own debut, pulling in over $100 million a year at its absolute peak. And a young Snoop Dogg was the protege, the breakout star the whole thing was built around. But then it all fell apart in spectacular fashion. And this is where it gets bleak. Tupac, the label's biggest star, was murdered in 1996. Its co-founder, Suge Knight, spiraled into legal chaos and is sitting in prison to this day. Dre walked away. And by 2006, the once mighty Death Row collapsed into bankruptcy and got auctioned off for a fraction of what it was once worth. For years after that, this iconic piece of black music history just got tossed from owner to owner like a hot potato. Bought at auction, folded into a company, and then, in one of the stranger twists, ending up owned by Hasbro, the toy company that makes Monopoly and My Little Pony. The label that scared middle America in the 90s was literally owned by the same folks who make children's board games. And that's the setup that makes Snoop's move so satisfying. In February 2022, he bought the Death Row brand back from the private equity firm that had ended up with it. And the timing was pure theater, because he announced it right before stepping onto the Super Bowl halftime stage in front of 100 million people. Now, an important detail that most coverage glosses over, and I want to be straight with you about it. Snoop bought the brand, the name, the logo, the trademark, and the rights to a chunk of the old catalog, including his own early albums. He's called himself one of the label's founding members, though technically he was the star artist, not one of the guys who started it. And exactly what he owns versus what he doesn't got messy fast, which is a story we'll come back to. But the symbolism was undeniable and it was enormous. For basically the first time ever, the artist who got made by a label came back and became the owner of it. So how does a rapper from Long Beach end up with the money and the mind to pull that off? To understand that, you have to look at how Snoop turned himself from a musician into a full-blown business operation. Chapter 2. The Mansion. He never left. Here's a detail that tells you everything about how Snoop actually thinks about money, and it surprises people every time. For a guy who came up in the world of rap excess, where the whole game is flexing bigger houses and flashier everything, Snoop has lived in the same house since 1998. The same one. It's in Diamond Bar, a quiet, affluent suburb about 30 miles east of Los Angeles. And he bought it for around $700,000 right after he left Death Row for Master P's No Limit Records. Now, 30 miles east of LA in a low-key suburb is not where you'd expect to find one of the most famous rappers alive. And that's kind of the point, because while other stars were leveraging themselves into $20 million Beverly Hills mega mansions and then losing them, Snoop parked himself in a guard-gated community and just stayed put. That modest house is now worth somewhere in the low millions, and he's clearly treating it as a permanent family anchor rather than a status symbol, to the point where he once sued a contractor for $500,000 over a bad renovation because he cares about keeping it right. But don't mistake staying in one house for not building a portfolio, because Snoop has quietly assembled a whole spread of California real estate around that anchor. He's got several other homes scattered across the Inland Empire and Diamond Bar area, some for family and some as income-generating rentals that he holds and collects steady money on. He even bought a townhouse decades ago for under $100,000 that's been quietly appreciating and paying him rent ever since. And back in the 90s, he did the flashier move too, buying a place in Claremont for around $600,000, expanding it massively with a basketball court and a recording studio and a home theater, and then flipping it years later for nearly $2 million. So the picture that emerges isn't a guy blowing money on trophies, it's a guy treating real estate like a patient long-term wealth machine, holding the good stuff and only selling when the number makes sense. But his actual headquarters, the real nerve center of the empire, isn't any of his homes at all. It's a building near the airport that he turned into something genuinely one of a kind. Speaking of holding on to what you own and only moving when the numbers are right, that is what pulled someone on our team to the Pulse R8 Smart Ring. It tracks your heart rate, your sleep, and your workouts straight from your finger. A week on a single charge, 100 days with the case, and it's fully waterproof. The part that got us was the price. Under $40, a fraction of what the big-name rings cost, because it comes direct instead of through the retailers that mark everything up. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to the futuristic hub where all of it quietly gets made. Chapter 3. The Spaceship Studios at Beach City. Here's where the empire actually runs from, and it's a lot cooler than a boardroom. 5 minutes from LAX in Inglewood, Snoop built out a 20,000-square-foot commercial complex called Beach City, and it functions as the beating heart of his entire media operation. This place is not a normal office, and that's the whole point. Under one roof, he's got the headquarters for his media ventures. A full-sized basketball court decorated with murals of the late Kobe Bryant, a soundstage for filming, game rooms, a radio broadcast studio, and even a private casino. It's built to be a place where business, creativity, and hanging out all blur into the same thing, which is basically the Snoop Dogg operating philosophy turned into architecture. He essentially built himself a grown-up clubhouse that also happens to be a fully functional media company, and that combination is exactly why talent and collaborators want to be there. But the crown jewel of Beach City is the recording setup, which he leaned all the way into a spaceship theme for, and honestly, it rules. There are 3 studios, and they're named like a sci-fi fleet. The main one is called the Mothership, the second is the Battleship, and the third, built as a creative space for his son, is the Starship. The Mothership in particular is stacked with the kind of high-end analog gear that serious producers get genuinely emotional about, including a custom monitoring system nicknamed the Dogg that pushes 10,000 watts of sound through it. The technical details matter less than what they represent, which is that Snoop didn't just build a vanity studio. He built a world-class professional facility that artists actually want to record in, generating value and pulling the culture toward him. So he's got the label, the real estate, and the headquarters. But the part of his empire that's quietly made him serious money is the one nobody expected from a rapper, and it's all about a plant. Chapter 4. The Weed Empire. That's actually a tech fund. Everybody knows Snoop Dogg and cannabis go together. It's basically his entire public brand. But here's what almost nobody realizes. Snoop didn't just become a stoner mascot. He became a legitimate venture capitalist in the weed industry. And this is genuinely one of the smartest things he's done. Back in 2015, way ahead of the curve, he co-founded a venture capital firm called Casa Verde Capital, and it grew to manage around $300 million in assets. And here's the clever part, the part that shows real business thinking. Casa Verde mostly doesn't touch the actual plant. Instead of getting into the messy, heavily regulated business of growing and selling weed directly, Snoop's firm invests in the boring, high-value stuff around it, the picks and shovels of the green rush. They put money into the software that dispensaries use to run their registers and track inventory, into the delivery logistics platforms that get the product to your door legally, into the fintech companies that lend money to cannabis businesses that regular banks won't touch. It's the exact strategy a sharp Silicon Valley investor would run, applied to an industry Snoop understood culturally better than any banker ever could. He turned his reputation into deal flow. And of course, he's got the consumer-facing side too, because leaving that on the table would be silly. He's got his own premium dispensary brand with physical stores in LA. And in 2025, he launched a direct-to-consumer cannabis line built right on top of the Death Row name, tying his newest business to his oldest one. So while the public sees Snoop as the guy who's always smoking in his videos, what's actually happening underneath is a diversified bet on an entire emerging industry, structured so he makes money whether or not any single dispensary succeeds. But the Weed Fund is just one piece of a much wider web of investments, and some of the others are even more surprising, though not all of them worked out the way he hoped. Chapter 5. The Investor. Nobody saw coming. If I told you a 90s gangster rapper was quietly an early investor in some of the biggest tech companies of the last decade, you might not believe me. But that's exactly what Snoop has been doing, and it reframes how you should think about him entirely. Years ago, Snoop put money into Reddit back when the whole company was valued at around $500 million, which, given what Reddit is worth now after going public, was a genuinely shrewd early bet. He's taken equity stakes in major fintech platforms like the stock trading app Robinhood and the buy now pay later company Klarna, both of which became huge. This is not the behavior of a musician who got lucky. It's the behavior of someone building a real, diversified investment portfolio across tech and finance, using the capital his fame generates as fuel. And he stacks steady income on top of it through a relentless run of endorsement deals. Everything from Dunkin' to Corona to Solo Stove, including a reported multi-million-dollar deal with a food delivery giant and a jaw-dropping $500,000 a day for his charming meme-worthy coverage of the Paris Olympics. But it hasn't all been winners, and it's worth being honest about that, because two of his most publicized recent plays hit walls. The first is a genuinely troubling story. Snoop teamed up with Master P to launch a cereal called Snoop Cereal, with the stated goal of getting more Black-owned products onto grocery shelves. They partnered with a big cereal company to distribute it, and then it fell apart in a lawsuit, with Snoop and Master P alleging that the partner and the retailer deliberately buried the product, keeping boxes in stockrooms and marking them as out of stock so they wouldn't sell. The other side denied it and said the cereal just didn't sell well. That fight is a real black eye on an otherwise smooth run, and it shows that even Snoop's brand power has limits when he's up against entrenched corporate giants. And then there's the crypto chapter, which is where the story gets genuinely bumpy. Chapter 6. The Crypto Bets, the Good and the Ugly. Snoop dove headfirst into the whole Web3 and crypto world, and I'm going to give you the honest version of this, not the hype version, because the truth is a mix of some clever wins and one pretty embarrassing loss. Start with the loss, because it's a great cautionary tale. During the peak of the metaverse mania, Snoop launched something called the Snoopverse inside a blockchain platform called the Sandbox, basically buying virtual land in a digital world and building a virtual version of his mansion on it. And at the height of the frenzy, one investor paid around $450,000, real dollars, just to own the virtual plot of land next to Snoop's virtual house. It sounds insane because it was, and when the crypto market crashed, that virtual land market absolutely cratered, with values collapsing by well over 90%, meaning that $450,000 plot is now worth somewhere around $1,000. That's not Snoop's loss directly, but it tells you how frothy and dangerous that whole space he was promoting turned out to be. But here's the thing, and this is why you can't fully count him out, because Snoop actually made real money in crypto by focusing on selling limited digital drops rather than betting on virtual real estate. He released one of his albums as a set of collectible digital tokens, and the early premium versions sold for $5,000 each, pulling in over $40 million in just 5 days. He's frustrated enough with how little traditional streaming pays, reportedly citing a statement showing 1 billion streams earned him under $45,000, that he's been pushing hard toward alternative platforms that pay artists more directly. Now, whether those particular crypto streaming bets pan out long-term is genuinely unproven, and I wouldn't put money on any specific one, but the underlying instinct that artists get shortchanged by the old system and should own their distribution is the same instinct that made him buy death row in the first place. Which brings us right back to the question we left hanging, because Snoop's ownership of death row is not quite as clean as the headlines made it sound. Chapter 7. What he actually owns and the fight over it. Let's clear up the death row situation honestly, because it's more complicated and more interesting than the simple "Snoop bought back death row" headline, and the messiness is part of what makes it a real story. Here's what's solid. Snoop genuinely owns the death row brand, the name, the logo, the trademark, and the master recordings to his own classic death row albums like Doggy Style. That part is real, and it's his. But when he claimed in an early interview that he'd also snagged the masters to Dr. Dre's The Chronic, that got shot down almost immediately, because Dre's own lawyer publicly stated that Dre kept complete control of The Chronic, which came back to streaming under Dre's terms. And Tupac's masters? Those had already reverted to Tupac's estate, so those weren't Snoop's to buy either. though he said he has a good relationship with the estate and hopes to work together. So the honest picture is that Snoop owns the powerful brand and his own catalog, but not the entire crown jewel library people assumed. And on top of that, Suge Knight, the imprisoned co-founder, has loudly called the wholesale illegitimate from behind bars, adding a layer of old-school death row drama to the whole thing. But here's why it matters less than the critics think. Because Snoop's real genius was in what he did with the brand once he had it. First, he made a bold statement by pulling the entire death row catalog off of Spotify and Apple Music, publicly blasting streaming services for underpaying artists, before later striking a smarter distribution deal on his own terms. Then he started building the brand outward, into that direct-to-consumer cannabis line, into merchandise, into new music, treating death row not as a dusty museum piece, but as a living, valuable piece of intellectual property he could grow in every direction. He understood that even without every single old master recording, the death row name itself, that instantly recognizable logo of a man strapped in an electric chair, is a cultural asset worth a fortune if you know how to use it. And using cultural assets that way is the single thread that ties his entire empire together. Chapter 8. The Real Blueprint. So step back and look at the whole thing, because once you see the pattern, Snoop Dogg stops looking like a lucky rapper and starts looking like one of the sharpest cultural businessmen alive, sitting on a net worth in the neighborhood of $160 million. Here's the blueprint, and it's genuinely instructive. Snoop takes the one thing he has more of than almost anyone, cultural capital, the trust and attention and cool that he's built up over 30 years, and he systematically converts it into ownership. He doesn't just rent his fame out for endorsement checks and call it a day, though he happily takes those checks too. He uses the fame to get early access to tech deals a normal investor would never see, to raise a $300 million cannabis fund, to buy back the very label that made him, to command $500,000 a day just to narrate the Olympics with a smile. Every move is the same underlying trade. Turn cultural power into a hard, appreciating asset that keeps paying long after the moment passes. Some of those bets miss, like the cereal fight and the frothy metaverse land, and he's honest enough to keep swinging anyway. And that's the thread that runs through all of it, from the house he refused to leave in 1998, to the spaceship studios in Inglewood, to the death row logo he brought back home. Snoop Dogg figured out something most entertainers never do, which is that fame is not the prize, fame is the raw material. And the real game is converting it into things you own outright before the spotlight moves on. Most rappers from his era were chasing the next hit. Snoop was quietly buying the label, the real estate, the equity, and the brands, building something designed to outlast the music entirely. He didn't just survive the industry that chews people up. He bought a piece of it. And that might be the most gangsta thing he ever did. If stories about how the biggest names turn fame into empires they actually own are what brought you here, subscribe to Black Status, and we'll keep delivering them. See you in the next one.